In the summer of 1944, General George Patton's Third Army stopped. Not because the Germans stopped them, not because Patton lacked the will to drive forward. The Third Army halted in eastern France because it had run out of gasoline. The advance that had covered 400 miles in 3 weeks, the fastest armored advance in American military history to that point, came to a standstill on the plains of Lorraine because there was not enough fuel to keep the tanks moving. Patton was furious. He reportedly told Bradley he could end the war in 2 weeks if someone would just give him the gas. This moment, the most famous supply failure in American military history, is the exception that proves the rule. The American Army in World War II came close to the edge of logistical collapse exactly once, in the summer of 1944, when the speed of its own advance outran its supply chain by hundreds of miles. Then it improvised a solution in 38 hours, executed it with more than 6,000 trucks, and never again faced quite the same fuel emergency. That improvisation had a name, the Red Ball Express, and understanding what it was, what it took to build it, who ran it, and why it worked, is understanding one of the real reasons the war in Europe ended in May 1945 instead of 1946 or 1947. Because the Germans were not stopped at the Rhine, because American soldiers were braver or better trained. They were stopped, in large part, because American soldiers never ran out of things to fight with. And making that happen was one of the greatest organizational achievements in the history of warfare. To understand the logistics miracle, you have to understand the scale of what an army at war consumes. A single American infantry division in combat required approximately 750 tons of supplies per day. Ammunition, food, fuel, medical equipment, replacement parts, communications gear. Every day, 750 tons. An armored division required more. By August 1944, there were 28 Allied divisions operating in France and Belgium. Do the math. The minimum daily supply requirement was somewhere north of 20,000 tons. Per day. Every day. Delivered to a moving front that had just covered 400 miles in a month. The supply chain that was supposed to handle this ran 500 miles back to the beaches of Normandy, where ships were still unloading because the deepwater ports, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Antwerp, were either damaged, captured late, or not yet operational. The French railway system, which was the logical alternative to trucks, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombers before D-Day to prevent German reinforcement. It worked brilliantly as a pre-invasion strategy and created a catastrophic logistics problem afterward. The roads were narrow French country lanes. The distances were continental. The demand was enormous and growing. The original Operation Overlord logistics plan proved inadequate. It assumed rail would be available by the time the front had advanced this far. It wasn't. The only available solution was trucks. The problem was that there weren't enough trucks. The Army had authorized 160 trucking companies for the ETO. Pre-invasion estimates said 240 were needed to sustain a serious advance. And those 160 companies were now being asked to supply armies operating at the far end of a 500-mile supply line, over roads that weren't designed for this volume, without adequate maps, without adequate maintenance facilities, without adequate anything. What happened next was the American answer to an impossible problem. In the last week of August 1944, American logistics officers held a 38-hour planning session that produced one of the most audacious supply operations in military history. The concept was simple. Take every available truck. Designate 2 parallel roads, one running east toward the front, one running west back to the depots, and close them entirely to civilian traffic. Post military police at every intersection. Run the trucks in continuous convoy, around the clock, with no stops for anything that wasn't an emergency. The system borrowed its name from a railroad term for express priority shipping, the Red Ball. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began operating. by August 29th, 4 days later, 132 truck companies were running 5,958 vehicles in continuous convoy, delivering 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day. That was the peak. It went unmatched for the next 14 weeks of the operation's existence. The trucks drove at dangerous speeds through blackout conditions, headlights off, navigating by the dim running lights of the vehicle ahead. They were overloaded. The official weight limit for a 2.5-ton truck was 2.5 tons. Quartermaster officers routinely sent them out carrying 5 tons or more because the armies needed the supplies more than they needed the trucks protected. The trucks broke down constantly and were repaired by the roadside and put back into rotation. Drivers worked until they literally could not stay awake, stopped for an hour or two, and got back behind the wheel. By the time the Red Ball Express shut down in November 1944, when the port of Antwerp finally opened and made the supply line manageable again, it had delivered 412,193 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment to 28 Allied divisions in 83 days. What is almost never mentioned in any account of the Red Ball Express is who ran it. 3/4 of all Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers. At a time when the American military was rigidly segregated, the Army had channeled black soldiers disproportionately into service and supply units rather than combat roles. Black soldiers made up roughly 10% of the Army, but nearly 21% of service units. Approximately 73% of the motor transport companies in the ETO were staffed by black soldiers. The decision to put black soldiers in supply rather than combat roles was made on explicitly racist grounds. The prevailing military assumption was that black soldiers were less capable fighters. The effect, in one of history's more uncomfortable ironies, was to concentrate the Army's most essential logistics function in the hands of the men military leadership had decided to sideline. When the advance across France stalled for want of supplies, it was black drivers who solved the problem, running day and night, overloaded, in blackout conditions, while the frontline units whose advance they enabled were segregated against them. These were the men who kept the armies supplied. The soldiers who won the race across France did it on the backs of drivers whose names went largely unrecorded and whose contribution went largely unacknowledged. The Red Ball Express solved the distribution problem. But distribution is only half of logistics. The other half is production. And there, the United States had an advantage that was not improvised, not a response to crisis, but the result of a century of industrial development that had no equivalent anywhere in the world. By 1944, American factories were producing what no other country on Earth could match for output or pace. The Willow Run Bomber Plant in Michigan, a single factory, was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes by April 1944. Not per day, every 63 minutes, around the clock. The assembly line ran more than a mile long. The same automobile industry that had built one car every 69 seconds in peacetime had converted its production lines within months of Pearl Harbor and was now building the weapons of a world war at assembly line speed. By the end of the war, American industry had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 102,000 tanks, and 44 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. 44 billion. By 1944, the United States was the largest industrial power in the Allied war effort by an enormous margin. The country had also launched more merchant shipping tonnage in 1941 alone than Japan built in the entire war. None of this happened automatically. The War Production Board, established after Pearl Harbor, converted civilian factories to military production at a pace that astonished even the Americans running the effort. Ford's Willow Run, Kaiser's Liberty shipyards on the Pacific coast, where workers eventually assembled Liberty ships in as little as 4 days, from keel laying to launch. Chrysler's tank plant in Detroit, which occupied a 65-acre single-floor facility specifically designed for tank assembly. When Roosevelt called for 50,000 aircraft per year in 1940, his own advisors thought it was propaganda. By 1944, the country was building nearly 100,000 per year. Germany, meanwhile, was fighting a two-front war with a bombed-out transportation network, contested oil supplies, and an industrial base being systematically dismantled from above. By 1944, Allied bombing had caused Germany to produce 35% fewer tanks than planned, 31% fewer aircraft, and 42% fewer trucks. Germany's Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was launched without sufficient fuel to sustain it. Hitler's plan required capturing American fuel dumps. When that failed, the panzers stopped moving. Not because the Americans stopped them, but because the Germans ran out of gas. Patton had complained about running out of gas in August 1944. The difference is that when Patton's army stopped, American logistics found a solution in 38 hours. When German panzers stopped in December 1944, there was no solution. The factory that would have solved it was already ashes. There is a version of this story that presents itself as pure triumph. American industry mobilized, American trucks rolled, American soldiers fought, and victory followed. That version is true as far as it goes, but it omits the part that makes the story real. It omits the Red Ball drivers who did not sleep for 2 and 3 days because the armies could not stop, and neither could they. The men who fixed broken trucks on the roadside at 3 in the morning in the French dark and got back behind the wheel because there was no one else. The stevedores unloading ships in the damaged French ports. The engineers repairing the roads the convoys were destroying. The supply clerks tracking 700,000 different line items of equipment across a theater that stretched from the Channel Coast to the Rhine. It omits the women on the home front, assembling artillery shells at plants across America, working under conditions that the Army classified secrets so tightly that some of them didn't know what they were making. The women who built the VT fuses. The assembly lines where workers pressed 20-hour days because the men at the front could not afford to wait. And it omits the honest accounting. The system had real failures. Artillery ammunition ran genuinely short in the fall of 1944 and into 1945. Not because the system was broken, but because the war consumed shells faster than revised production forecasts had anticipated, and it took months to catch up. The Army response was direct shipment from factories to front, cutting 10 days out of the supply chain. The shortage was real. So was the fix. That is the American logistics story in full. Not a perfect machine, but a correcting one. A system that ran short, improvised, reorganized, and kept running. A system that absorbed failures and produced solutions faster than any opposing force could match. All of it built on the labor of people who were never going to make the monuments. The black drivers running through the French night because the segregated army had decided they were better suited to supply than to combat, and who kept the front alive anyway, with no recognition and no relief column coming for them either. Germany was not defeated because American soldiers were always better fighters. They were, often enough, but so were German soldiers in the brutal, close-quarters arithmetic of individual combat. Individual courage was never the variable that separated the two armies by 1945. Supply was. Germany was defeated because, by 1945, German soldiers were fighting with what was left after 3 years of Allied bombing and 2 fronts consuming resources the German economy could not replace. By the time the war ended, many German formations were fighting under severe ammunition and fuel constraints. Some were still dependent on horses for transport. American soldiers in the same month were drawing on supply chains that had been improvised, rebuilt, and continuously expanded since the beaches of Normandy. The rifles kept firing, the tanks kept moving, the guns kept shooting. That did not happen by accident. It happened because 50,000 truck drivers, 3/4 of them black soldiers the Army had judged unfit for combat, drove through the French night to supply armies that would not have lasted a week without them. Because factory workers in Michigan and Ohio and Mississippi pressed production lines that never stopped. Because logistics officers, who had never imagined this problem, improvised a solution in 38 hours, and it worked. Because the United States had built, in the 2 decades between the wars, the industrial capacity to produce weapons at a pace the world had never seen, and has not seen since. The guns went quiet in Europe in May 1945. The reason they went quiet on the German side first is because the German side ran out of things to fight with. The American side didn't. That is the real story of what won the war in Europe. Not just the courage of the men who pulled the triggers, the courage of the people who made sure the triggers kept working. If that's the kind of history you're here for, the story behind the story, the one that doesn't fit on a monument, subscribe. There's more coming.